this is the Green and Red podcast, and GNR today stands for griping and ranting, because this is our second segment of the Week in Review, where Scott Parkin from Berkeley, California, our wonderful co-host, and I just pick a couple topics that we want to talk about, that we feel strongly about, and we just kind of go off on those. So, but before we do that, we thank you, obviously, for, in this case, watching us on our YouTube channel. And if you haven't, go down and click that subscribe button and follow us and all that kind of stuff. We're recording this, and we have a few kind of dates that are important as we record this on September 9th. And we just want to mention those. 50 years ago today, we're recording this on the 9th, was the biggest and bloodiest prison uprising in U.S. history at Attica prison in New York. Over 1,200 of the about 2,000 or so inmates had an uprising there. They went on strike for better conditions. Those 1,200 inmates took 42 hostages. They had a series of demands met for better conditions. The state agreed to some of them, but the governor, Nelson Rockefeller, kind of a law and order kind of governor, kind of like Trump was last summer, refused to meet with the prisoners and refused to kind of give in to some of their more important demands. And eventually sent in the state police, who opened fire. They claimed that a guard had been killed by the prisoners, and ultimately 43 people were killed. 33 were inmates, but also 10 were guards and civilians. And so the legacy of Attica is still with us today in the American carceral system. And then two very important events occurred on September 11th. On September 11th, 1973, in Chile, the socialist government of Salvador Allende was overthrown, ousted in a coup led by the military and General Augusto Pinochet. But behind that coup were the very obvious fingerprints of the United States government and the CIA. In particular, there were a lot of American investments in Chile, which Allende was trying to nationalize or tax, the most important of which were Kennecott and Anaconda Copper and AT&T. And so the United States had been trying to get rid of Allende for some time. And Henry Kissinger, this was two of Henry Kissinger's greatest quotes ever. He said, Chile is a dagger aimed at the heart of Antarctica. And then, of course, the better known one is, we're not going to let a country go socialist due to the stupidity of its own voters. And so the original September 11th, 1973 was when Allende was overthrown and then eventually killed himself, more likely, or possibly murdered. It's still not quite clear. And then the other 9/11, which Scott and I did a show about last year, which we'll also put up again, of course, was the famous 9/11 that occurred on 2001, the attacks on Washington and New York. And I'm going to let you can say something about it. The only thing I want to say is, when that happened, I said, this is different. Everything's changed forever. And 20 years later, because it's been 20 years, hard to believe, because we were together that day. 20 years later, what I'm seeing is essentially that actually nothing has changed. The bad stuff is now on steroids. It's just gotten worse. All the stuff we worried about then really hasn't gotten any better. And it's just like way worse now. So like, I thought the world has changed. It's never going to be the same. In fact, it kind of is. So I know you wanted to say something about that too.
First thing
Oh, good. I was going to say, because as Americans go, you know as much about the post 9/11 repression as anybody does. So I think you kind of uniquely qualified to talk about this. So.
The first thing I want to say is that Henry Kissinger is a profile motherfucker, and the fact that he's still alive,
he's still fucking alive, and
he's a fucking vampire. Just want to put that out there. But just a couple things I'll say about 9/11 is that, in a sense, it was. We actually, there's lots of, theories and frames around shocks. And so 9/11 was a shock. And it's always a shock for either the forces of movement or the forces of order that we've talked about, quoting Arno Mayer. And so, 9/11 very much was an opportunity for the forces of order, and the repression that we'd already been seeing targeting social movements, let alone just the foreign policy, debacles that we got into in the post 9/11 in the post 9/11 era, and we're going to actually on 9/11 re-air our anniversary of 9/11 from last year, and probably also the also the recent arc we did around Afghanistan and Daniel Hale, et cetera. Probably all be put out that day, so pay attention to our social media channels. But the thing I want to kind of focus in on is that was an opportunity for the government, for the state to and the corporations to kind of zero in on like social movements. And so in the post 9/11 era, we had this chilling effect. This was already underway, but there was a phenomenon known as the Green Scare, where radical environmentalists and animal rights activists were being targeted, and corporations used the post 9/11 era to pass a whole lot of legislation. Animal Enterprise Terror Act, it's when they passed the Patriot Act. All those legislation were like existing, maybe not passed, but it was an opportunity for the corporations to collude with the state to kind of create that. A friend of ours and regular guest on the show, Jake Conroy, was actually a recipient of that. He actually ended up doing, nearly 4 years or 3.5, 4 years in prison, in federal prison, where he had a terrorism enhancement. We'll probably be having a future show with some civil liberties lawyers to talk about terrorism enhancements on environmental activists and animal rights activists. But I just want to kind of say that the post 9/11 era really saw this like new heightened era of repression, legislation, law enforcement, surveillance, as well as there was this sort of cultural phenomenon where a lot of people within social movements were like rightfully fearful that the government was going to come down on them, and so that is actually a pretty important legacy of 9/11. I think we should actually have a show sometime in the future on the Green Scare and the impacts of it from 15 or 20 years ago, but just kind of want to put that out there. And then we also had the foreign policy debacles of Afghanistan and Iraq and Obama's drone war, all of that.
Yeah, today I just came back from teaching and I was discussing the Espionage and Sedition Acts and Gene Debs, and I pointed out that what we're seeing today is just really a different variant of that. It's also a birthday, a notable birthday day of somebody who we pick on a lot, but he's actually kind of a good guy. He's a mensch, and that's you can sing if you want, like kind of do like Marilyn Monroe impersonation.
Happy birthday, Senator Sanders. And so today, September 9th, we'll be airing this tomorrow morning, but today is Bernie Sanders' 80th birthday. And like Bob said, we have critiques of Bernie, but as far as sort of moving the needle to the left, as far as within the existing system and within the existing political class, it's like Bernie is one of the main people who do that, and just want to say happy birthday to Bernie. Like we have critiques, but we're still friends. So.
Yeah, I mean,
and Bernie also puts out some great memes for us from time to time.
Yeah.
I just want to give him big props for that.
I think of Bernie like the Beatles. Like I don't like the Beatles, but like they're actually not as bad as I think they are. But Beatles fans just annoy the shit out of me, and Bernie bros just annoy the shit out of me. Like Bernie's a man; he's a good guy. He's as good as you're gonna get. But those Bernie people at Jacobin and in New York, I mean, like he walks on freaking water. I keep thinking of him as name's Chauncey Gardner at the end of Being There. So, but Bernie, you're a good guy. You're a mensch. We like you here at Green and Red. So to get on to the nuts and bolts of things, you have a visitor coming into your state. I don't know if you're going to get a chance to meet him, but Joe Biden is going to be there, right?
Yeah. So
to talk about, we have two issues today that I think you want to talk about. Obviously, climate change, and then you have a big election coming up.
Yeah, so both those things, I'll just on those. First of all, Joe Biden is going to be in California on Monday. He'll be in Sacramento and Long Beach, and he's coming to survey wildfire damage. And then he is coming to campaign for Gavin Newsom, who's in the fight of his life, even though he's now 20 points ahead in the polls from Recall. And so just talking about climate change a little bit, I don't even like calling it climate change. To talk about the climate crisis a little bit, the first thing I want to say is that we're actually seeing an unprecedented era of ecological collapse. And so the way that's playing out in California is we're seeing a lot of wildfires. And so, this summer, there's every wildfire season is worse than the previous one. And so, the Calder fire actually has burned about over 200,000 acres. They actually had to evacuate the city of South Lake Tahoe, in the last week because the fire got so bad. It's now it's being contained and under control, and so the evacuation order has been rescinded. But that has been a pretty bad fire. And then all summer we've actually had the largest fire, I believe, in California history, which is the Dixie Fire, which has burned over 900,000 acres. And these are just like, there's like hundreds of fires going on in the West and in California. And so, but these are just two of the big notable ones. And the thing about it is that just like reading the news today, large swaths of California from San Diego to Sacramento are actually under a heat advisory where they expect through the end of the week, where they actually expect more wildfires to come. And so there's that, there's the wildfires. The wildfires are also like, just like in the news, it's also been about how much they've been ravaging the Mediterranean. And so like Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Algeria have all seen like wildfires like we're seeing here in the West, in the American West, in California, like in Oregon last summer. And so, direct impact of changing weather patterns, more carbon in the atmosphere, the heat going up, all of that. And so we're in this like moment where there's so much carbon in the atmosphere that even if we move to what science is telling us that we need to move to, like, an 80% reduction by 2050 or what have you, or 50% by 2030, is like, we're still like gonna, probably for our lifetime, at least our lifetimes, we'll be seeing the impacts of climate change, and it's just gonna get worse and worse each year. The other thing about California is we're also in a pretty bad drought. So, part of the world is burning, the other part of the world is drowning. And so we actually just had Hurricane Ida hit the Gulf Coast. Then it like made its way thousands of miles away to hit New York and New Jersey and Philadelphia. We actually just did a show, which we put up this week, with Scott Crow and Sunsteer Ali Shakur, who were part of the Common Ground relief effort and have been doing mutual aid and promoters of mutual aid, and doing solidarity work with people facing Hurricane Ida, the aftermath of Hurricane Ida. And so the world is burning and drowning. There's a lot of other impacts from climate going on. And so who is going to be most responsible for this is the fossil fuel sector, who basically still gets carte blanche from, the world's governments in many ways to just do whatever they want. I'll say that we've done multiple shows this summer, have another one coming out in the next couple of days on the Line 3 pipeline. It's been a pretty brutal fight up there. It's going up there. It's like a direct action conflict zone where the police are like, it's a police state. Like, there's no other word for it. They pull over people they think are suspected of protests. They are like throwing pretty hardcore charges against people. I think there's 1,000 people have been arrested. 100 of them in that range have been charged with felonies. The police have used rubber bullets. They've used tear gas. They've thrown high bales at people. I mean, it's pretty intense, and that's how the state is responding. Like, the earth is changing, nature is changing, mostly because of human impact. Movements are responding, trying to get the state and the corporations to like not destroy the planet, and then the state has responded with like escalated police violence, escalated legal tactics, etc. And so what we see at Line 3 is like not too different than what we saw at Standing Rock 5 years ago, what we've seen in some of the Keystone fights that happened in Texas and Oklahoma, and what we're going to be seeing, in lots of other places. The other thing I'll say here is that what's happening in the U.S. is just like there's these like non-lethal violence I'm talking about, or escalated police charges. Environmental defenders all over the world actually face death and torture for fighting against these corporate, whether it's a mining company or agribusiness. We could talk about countries like Brazil and Colombia and the Philippines and Indonesia, where people are like facing like serious, extrajudicial violence or legal violence. And so just kind of like an important thing is that there's a thin green line of people who are fighting these things, and then there's like the overwhelming force of the state. And so we need to continue to organize. We need more people involved here.
What did Chico Mendes say? Without politics, environmentalism is just gardening or something like that?
Without class struggle.
Without class struggle.
Environmentalism is just gardening.
And I mean, I'm not asking you to like talk bad about your family, so to speak, but there are a lot of groups who've been active on this issue for a long time. And, this is obviously not their fault, but things are getting worse, right? I mean, do you see any kind of major movement that these environmental groups could make to actually, because the time is short and the problem is immense. Like, how would you evaluate what these groups are doing right now? Are they kind of going too slow? Are they taking the wrong approach? I know you're attacking banks, you're doing all the right stuff, but at the same time, you had a hurricane that may have done more damage in New York than in New Orleans, right? Which is insane, right?
Yeah.
So more people died in New York than in New Orleans, at least. So how would you evaluate what these groups are actually doing?
I mean, a couple things I would say is that obviously the environmental movement and the climate and climate justice movements are not monoliths.
Yeah.
And so I feel like there's a spectrum of what people think is effective, and there's like people on that spectrum who think making voluntary agreements with the corporations, or just like politely asking corporations or the government to like do something about this is the way to go. And then there's other people who are like taking serious action and putting their bodies on the line. I will say that there is a misallocation of resources. There's a lot of money that actually goes into the environmental movement, and a lot of it goes into these like super friendly, industry friendly, Biden friendly sort of groups, and they spend a lot of money on lobbying and things like that. It's still a drop in the bucket compared to what fossil fuels puts into the efforts to influence government. That's one thing. So I actually feel like we should be putting more money into people power. We should be putting more money into small groups and frontline groups, which are taking a lot of action. And then the other thing is that there's the industry is very clever, and so they've actually come up with a lot of false solutions to climate change, like things like carbon capture and storage, or clean coal, and nuclear also falls into that bucket. And so they spend a lot of their resources in promoting that to the public and to the more friendlier groups on the nonprofit side. And so I think challenging false solutions is an important thing too. I honestly think what we need is just more people taking the kind of action that we see at Line 3 and these other pipeline fights. And we need to allocate resources to make that happen.
And let me point out, because I'm contractually obligated to take a ding at Jacobin, and every time we're on the air, I think it was Bushkar Sankara wrote an article praising nuclear power recently. Yeah. So if this is the left's response to environmentalism, have they heard of Fukushima? Are they aware of that? Did they know that happened? I'm not even invoke 3 Mile Island. I don't have to.
I mean, I would say that the kind of important thing to the other thing to kind of like think about there is that we actually had a pretty big movement in the 70s and 80s which challenged nuclear power and won. Like Nixon administration seems like a drop in the bucket compared to the pipelines and coal plants. The Nixon administration in the early 70s wanted to build 100 new nuclear power plants. We had a mass movement rise up, and they stopped that. Like there was no new nuclear plants put online by the late 80s. And if anything, our friends at Jacobin, or our frenemies at Jacobin, and people in the environmental nonprofit industrial complex should really actually be thinking about that. It's like the mass movement works. We just need to, and if anything, climate change is an even more existential threat than nuclear power was.
That was mostly Jackson Brown and Jane Fonda, though, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Back in this, yeah. So I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, but you have something else going on in California right now, which I'm kind of enjoying, because you have one of the more batshit crazy people in America at the moment trying to become your new governor. And though we are not the biggest advocates of electoral politics, at the same time, this is one scary motherfucker. So you want to say a little bit about what's happening in the People's Republic of California? In the 70s, they used to call, conservatives would call California the land of fruits and nuts. So
it's still that. It's just they're conservative fruits and nuts, right? Yeah. So we have this recall election going on. There's like dozens of people. There's the option where you can vote to recall Gavin Newsom, and then there's the option to vote who's going to be the new governor, and there's dozens of people on that. But the sort of leader has been this right-wing talk radio host from Southern California named Larry Elder. And we're going to play a clip with Larry.
Right behind them.
By the way, when you mentioned that the UK was ahead of us, they were. Do you know that the slave owners were compensated? After they lost their quote-unquote property, the government compensated slave owners.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so when people talk about reparations, do they really want to have that conversation? Because, like it or not, slavery was legal. And so their property, their legal property, was taken away from them after the Civil War. So you can make an argument that the people that are owed reparations, and not only just black people, but also the people whose quote property close quote was taken away after the end of the Civil War.
So there's Larry Elder, in his own words, talking with PragerU, I guess, with Candace Owens, and it's I mean, just to kind of put it out there is that this is pretty much par for the course for people who are Republican governors, right? And so like other than that, this is California. This is pretty much what we're seeing from the GOP around the country.
That's kind of speechless, yeah, it's Candace Owens and Larry Elder. I mean, this is kind of the Republican Party likes to kind of bring African Americans like this front and center, right? Because it doesn't make them seem as racist as they really are. This is a party who has a senator from Arkansas named Cotton. So, but yeah, it's kind of scary. Now, for a while there, it looked like he actually, might have an outside, like a punch and shot and become a governor. But it looks like that's kind of changed now. I think Larry Elder has made Gavin Newsom very comfortable, his lead very comfortable.
Yeah, I would say that, well, first of all, Gavin Newsom has more money in his Stop the Recall committee than the recall committee / all of the Republican candidates combined, like maybe even twice or 3 times as much. And so he's just, there's a lot of ad buys going on. You can't get in the car and hear the radio without a pro Newsom radio ad. And like, I'm listening to, I'm listening to stuff that, middle-aged white guys like, which is like classic rock and things like that. And so that's like it's a particular demographic that's being targeted there. And then Newsom is also having like a lot of luminaries come out for him. Like we said, Biden's going to be here this week. Obama just dropped a video for Biden. Elizabeth Warren has been here. And so Newsom let's just say they're not fucking around. And Newsom is he's definitely, I have a lot of critiques of him, and I've actually been organizing against him for quite some time, even before he was governor. He was actually mayor of San Francisco, and I was a resident here. But it's like really notable that, talking about climate change and wildfires, is that Newsom has a pretty strong rap on climate, yet he continues to sign off on oil and gas permits. For the first half of 2020, even though he kind of ran on being a climate leader, he issued more than it's a statistic, it's a percentage here, but like he didn't actually release it. He didn't sign off on that many permits in the first half of 2020. The second half of 2020, it was 190% more drilling permits. And it's just like he signed off on them by the hundreds or thousands. I mean, the California state government is captured by the oil and gas industry no less than the Texas government. And so it's just like really notable that like, we have thousands of wells, a lot of fracking wells going on around the state, and yet Newsom, it's fascinating how he campaigns and frames himself as a climate champion. I feel like a lot of Democratic governors do that, and then they sign off on like things like the Line 3 pipeline, et cetera.
Well, it's a kinder, gentler machine gun hand, right? Like Neil Young said.
Yeah, exactly.
The thing about like the election there, which, is really terrifying, is that you have a senator who's, let's just say, not lucid, to be nice, who is a good friend of Lindsey Graham and really should have stepped down a long time ago and could at any moment, not to be nasty, die. And I think you would rather have Gavin Newsom replacing Dianne Feinstein, because Larry Elder might name Candace Owens to the Senate, and this alleged Democratic majority, which isn't a real thing anyway because of EpiPen Joe Manchin, would be even worse off.
And Kristen Sinema, yeah.
And Kristen Sinema, yeah. So, yeah, you don't want, I mean, if Feinstein, Feinstein and Breyer should have been gone a long time ago. They've learned nothing from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, absolutely nothing. And I'm still catching hell for it, and I don't care. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is as narcissistic as Trump. What she did was disgraceful. It was egotistical. she's as guilty of this as Hillary Clinton. They own it. They own this as much as Trump or anybody else for Kavanaugh and for Barrett and for Gorsuch. And so you don't want that to happen again. So you want to force her out, and you want to make sure Gavin Newsom picks her replacement. I mean, you'll get a corporate Democrat, but it's still, you don't want Larry Elder doing it. Is there anything else you want to say about the recall, or?
I mean, just that, there's a lot of things to critique Newsom on. Like he's from his campaign promises, he's fallen short on policing. He's definitely fallen short on homelessness. He had made a lot of big promises on housing, yet vetoed, bills to provide public housing. He's gotten a lot of critique from labor. There's a pretty bad labor fight happening here on healthcare between the nurses and some of the other unions. And yet, he continues to choose the wrong side in these things. Also we've had at least 3 major teacher strikes here in California, the biggest one being in Los Angeles with the United Teachers of Los Angeles. There's a lot of frustration with pay and work conditions and class sizes and things like that. And a lot of that kind of falls at the feet of Newsom. I mean, and so it's just to kind of keep that all in mind is there's a lot of problems with him. Still, he's not someone who thinks that slaveholders, the descendants of slaveholders or slave owners should be, get reparations. So it's amazing.
It's 2021.
I mean, to be honest, in the recall field, John Cox is a Republican who actually had run against Newsom for governor a couple cycles back. I forget his first name, but Falconer, who's the former governor of
Caitlyn Jenner.
And Caitlyn Jenner, but Falconer, who's the former mayor of San Diego, is also in the mix. But it's Elder, who's a Trump sort of conservative radio talk show host, is the one who's buoyed to the top. But I think it also says a lot about who the Republican Party is, whether it's in Orange County or Dallas County or Orlando.
All right. One thing I want to just spend a couple minutes on, because this is something we bring up all the time, and we like to pick on liberals. And one of the issues that's really kind of annoyed me for kind of a year now is that in the aftermath of the election, remember, just a week or two before the election, everybody said the Democrats are going to romp and Biden's going to win big and they're going to win 53 Senate seats and this and that and everything else. It didn't work out that way. And so in the aftermath, you had all these liberals, people like Roy Teixeira and Nancy Pelosi, and all these other people rushing and saying, well, it's because these activists were saying defund the police, and all these people were in the streets protesting, and because the Republican Party ran this law and order campaign. However, as we've pointed out many times, on January 5th, the day before the Capitol attacks, there were 2 Senate races in Georgia, and an African American and a Jewish candidate won. And the Republican campaign against those 2 was they're going to defund the police and they're socialist. And so, how on Facebook, that kind of what you did a year ago today or 5 years ago today. Well, this week, 2 things came up, and I think they're worth mentioning because I'm still pissed off at these kind of liberal Center for American Progress, Neeratin and Roy Teixeira hacks. They are the reason the Democratic Party has moved to the right for decades now, and why it's really just, it's right. Basically, Richard Nixon's Republican Party is today's Democratic Party. But at the end of August in 2020, there was a poll that asked whether people supported or opposed the Black Lives Movement, right? BLM. Overall, Black Lives Movement was supported by 53% of Americans and opposed by 34%. Among whites, 47 to 41 supporting. Among blacks, 73 to 17 supporting. Among Hispanics, 59 to 29 supporting Black Lives Matter. And among Asian Americans, 59 to 23%. Overwhelmingly then, what we see is this really significant support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is in late August. This is after the protests in the streets. This is after the Confederate flag statues were toppled. This is after Precinct 3 was burned. Still at that point. But what had happened in the interim? The Democratic Party immediately started to run away from it. Like days after defund the police became, kind of a thing, became an idea to be discussed. Liberals were going, sending out memes and emails, shrieking that this is a toxic slogan and you have to change it and you can't use these words, right? And I pointed out, you could call it the free ice cream and whiskey program if you get cops to kill fewer people, and the Republicans would still oppose it. But it was the Democrats and the liberals, people like Roy Teixeira, who ran away with it and condemned it. In the same way, a poll taken in September of 2020, again, after 3 months of uproar and street protest and so on, asked what was a better way to end these protests, through police reform or by punishing protesters. Americans overall said 60% said police reform, 25% said through punishment, 15% said neither, right? 60 to 25 said police reform was a better way to address these protests and the grievances than by going after the protesters. And obviously among Biden voters, it was 91 to 91 saying reform, but even 22% of Trump voters said reform was a better way to do it, and 23% of Trump voters said neither. So the idea that defund the police and holding the police accountable and demanding the police stop killing people was a political liability, was bullshit then, and is bullshit now. It was bullshit on January 5th in Georgia, and it still is today. And the fact of the matter is the Democrats recently took this performative bullshit vote with Cory Booker doing a performative bullshit performance, thanking the Republicans because they had a vote on defunding the police that was 99-0 against. Every senator said, no, we would never defund the police. We love the police. The reality was the police were being held accountable in the summer of 2020 because there were 30 million people in the streets, and the Democratic Party, the liberals, undercut that movement. They cut it in the Achilles heel. They said it's toxic. It's dead. We can't win on defunding. The reality was that in Georgia, it didn't matter, and it couldn't have mattered elsewhere too. They ran away from it. They snatched defeat from the jaws of victory like the Washington Generals often do. So I wanted to just rant about that again because these things showed up today, these two polls taken basically exactly a year ago, which showed that in fact, defunding the police and holding police accountable were not political liabilities until the Democrats made them so by running away from it, which is what they do because they're Democrats, which is why we need to organize outside of these elected officials and electoral politics in these political parties because the Democrats, they ain't going to save you. They're going to raise a lot of money. They're going to go to, you're going to get all kinds of petitions for move on. And, I'm already getting a million emails asking for money because of the Texas abortion laws, but they're not going to do anything about it.
No, they don't want to do anything to offend their corporate sponsors, right? And so, I mean, that's what at some level, if you're support, at least in the eyes of the corporate sponsors, if you're, endorsing whatever, if your actions endorse, Black Lives Matter or defund the police, then that's the road to socialism. Even though it's okay when the corporations co-opt those messages and they put up banners on your local Whole Foods about, Black Lives Matter or whatever, but it's kind of an important kind of distinction to make with what a lot of Democrats do is that they are just looking to appease their corporate sponsors.
Well, I think, we're kind of done here, but the abortion issue is really instructive on this because, for 40 years, the right has said we're going to get rid of abortion. And people thought that was insane, right? You're never going to overturn Roe v. Wade, but they kept going at it, even though it's never been a popular position. Getting rid of Roe v. Wade has never had a significant level of support. And Americans in every poll I've ever seen have said, no, we have to keep abortion rights, right? Now, there's a big middle group that says with some restrictions, but getting rid of Roe v. Wade has never been a big, and even in Texas, it's not supported. Yet they kept plugging away while the liberals were shrieking, and we need to keep the Supreme Court. Well, they couldn't even do that because Obama didn't even name a replacement. He could have put somebody in there that they had to get rid of. They couldn't make Ruth Bader Ginsburg retire because her ego got in the way, and now they're screaming and shrieking and trying to raise money because of the Supreme Court when they don't do anything, So,
Feinstein gave Amy Coney Barrett a pretty easy pathway onto the Supreme Court.
Yeah, she told Lindsey Graham it's the best hearing she'd ever attended, right? So anyway, we're getting a little ageist here as well, but what the hell? I'm an old man myself. So anyhow, that's kind of all I have to bitch about right now. I could go on and on, but we want to keep this a little short and we need more to talk about next week. So any last words from you other than to tell people how to support us and why they should love us and why we're better than Brooklyn and all that stuff?
Berkeley and Montrose are much more fun places to be than Brooklyn. If you want to, I'll just kind of go with our ending. If you want to check us out on social media, go to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube and hit that red subscribe button at the bottom. Please always rate and review the Green and Red podcast on all of your favorite Apple podcasts or all of your audio podcast listening platforms. And then if you want to be a donor, go to greenredpodcast.org and hit that support button and make a one-time donation, or go to patreon.com/greenredpodcast and hit and become a recurring donor. And this is a new segment that we're doing. We're still workshopping it. We're still workshopping the name, and it's gonna be it's a thing we're gonna do on the regular. But check us out and share it around, and we'll be talking to you soon. And make
And
some
if any
trouble.
of you have any ideas on, about what we could call it other than the week in review, which is kind of boring, let us know. We can have like a fan, kind of a fan contest or something like that.
Yeah.
Talking
Just
Sopranos had fans on this week, so we could do that,
Yeah, just email us at greenredpodcast@gmail with any ideas for the show.
Thank you.
Thanks. Talk to you soon.